Hello, everybody. So excited to have this panel. I don't think I've never had a panel on the podcast before, but you have to listen to this show because it is awesome. We got some awesome guests right now. They're going to introduce themselves. They're all attorneys and they represent law enforcement officers, high profile cases too. And they're going to talk about it as well as other hot topics in law enforcement. Let's go around the room and start with my good friend, Vaughn. Can you introduce yourself and a little bit about yourself, sir?
Sure. My name is Kliem. The reason I'm here, I hope, is I was a police officer for about 10 years. I then became an attorney, was a federal prosecutor. I now work with Force Science Institute as the executive editor, and I'm a senior policy attorney for Lexipol and the owner of Kliem Consulting. And in that capacity, I've been able to see how legislation has been affecting what's happening on the ground with our law enforcement officers, and really wanted to have a chance to talk with some of the civil litigators out there that are having to deal with a lot of these very fast changes. So I'm excited for this conversation, and thank all the panelists for agreeing to join with us tonight, and look forward to seeing where we're able to take this.
That's awesome. Thank you, Vaughn. Laura, let's go to you, ma'am.
All right. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel, Patrick. My name is Laura Scarry, and I am a partner in my law firm of Diano and Scarry. Our home office is in Chicago, Illinois. I'm also a faculty member of the Force Science Institute. And like Vaughn, I also am an attorney working behind the scenes for Lexipol. And most of my practice involves, representing police officers in civil litigation. Prior to my being an attorney, I was a police officer way back when, starting in 1986, and then after 7 years, I decided to go to law school. But since being an attorney, most of my practice is in civil litigation, although I have to tell you that within the last 10 years, I'm becoming more involved in disciplinary matters. I'm not a union attorney. I am hired by unions sometimes to represent police officers in the immediate aftermath of officer-involved shootings, but I would not characterize myself as a union attorney. But I do assist unions. And then I'm also hired to represent police officers when officers want to go outside for whatever reason, having that union representation. So, I guess the thing that makes me tick is being available for officers 24/7, because nowadays, as attorneys, we can't just be 9 to 5. We have to be available 24/7 because the stuff is hitting the fan. And I don't know about the other panelists, but I'm having a hard time just staying up, keeping up with everything that's transpiring, in our wonderful United States. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here.
Yes, a lot going on in this great country. Thank you, Laura, for being here. Scott, let's go to you, sir.
My name's Scott Wood. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I got a criminal justice degree at Colorado State in 1979, came back to Tulsa and got on the Tulsa Police Department. And I was there for just a little under 5 years, and then went to law school at the University of Tulsa. And then I went into private practice, did a lot of insurance defense, did a lot of medical malpractice defense. And as fate would have it, I needed an expert witness in a convenience store case where someone got injured, had security and police-related matters in it. I started talking to a guy that I'd been on the police department with back in the early 80s. And he was just in the early stages of getting the National Tactical Officers Association off the ground, Sergeant Jim Clark. He said, man, I've been doing expert witness stuff around the country, and attorneys do not understand use of force. And it was around that time the FOP Legal Defense Plan came into existence, and I left and founded my own firm, and had some new clients. And as soon as the insurer of most of the towns and cities in Oklahoma found out that I used to be a police officer, they're like, oh, well, you must know all about 1983 cases. And I was like, well, hadn't the statute of limitations ran on all those? I don't know why they'd still be litigating those. No. So like within a year, I transformed from a medical malpractice attorney and went back to representing police officers in disciplinary matters, representation in criminal investigations immediately following shootings. And then I have a caseload. I've probably got 30 or 40 1983 cases in federal court here in Oklahoma. We have 3 different districts. So I'm like Laura. I'm smashed. I've never been this busy in my life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, Scott. I appreciate it. Last but not least, Lance. Thank you, sir.
I appreciate you having me. My name is Lance LoRusso. I'm the general counsel for the Georgia Fraternal Order of Police, and I was a law enforcement officer for a long time, still serve in several different capacities in law enforcement. I guess I've been continually sworn since 1987 in one capacity or another. Do a lot of training in the area of use of force, everything from firearms to defensive tactics to driving and all sorts of other areas. I teach about 2,000 cops a year before the zombie apocalypse COVID hit us. So we've had some conferences that have canceled, but I've spoken in Georgia and in the United States and Canada, licensed in Tennessee, Georgia, and Arkansas, which has brought some interesting perspective that law enforcement officers all over the United States are facing the same things. I've represented over 100 officers involved in officer-involved shootings. We do respond out to the scene. And I have a firm in Atlanta. We have offices in Atlanta, Georgia, Columbus, Chattanooga, Tennessee, and soon to be opening up an office in Alabama. Staffed by attorneys. We do a lot of catastrophic personal injury cases. Unfortunately, one of the most dangerous things, all of us having worn the badge know, driving a car is about the most dangerous thing you do as a cop. But a lot of the lawyers that are working with me are retired law enforcement, former law enforcement, and they get it. They get exactly what these folks are going through. So we handle everything from the disciplinary appeals to the officer-involved shootings, appearing in front of the grand jury, some of the absolute crazy legislation and legislative issues that we deal with. And we'll get involved here or there with some plaintiffs' cases. I've been very, very happy to bring plaintiffs' cases affirmatively on behalf of some officers who have been injured, people who have made false sexual assault complaints against officers, people who have shot officers in the line of duty and then sued their estates. We had an officer who was shot in the line of duty. The bad guy's family wouldn't set up an estate, so I set up an estate, appointed another lawyer to represent it, and then sued it because giving up is overrated.
Wow.
You're my hero.
I love it, Lance. And just a really quick side note, I saw something on social. I think it was today, brother. I don't know when you posted it, when somebody said, how long are you going to continue to represent law enforcement? And there's a scene in there from, I think it was A Son of a Woman, where Al Pacino is saying, I'm just getting warmed up. Love it.
Yeah, there's a very good friend of mine who it has gotten some threats, and had his office torn up a few times and spray painted. And I had some really good friends come to me who are attorneys, who are like, are you done yet? It's like, no, I'm not done.
Yeah. And that's what it takes in this environment, as you all know. And again, thank you all for being here. What makes this panel, I believe, very unique is not only are you excellent litigators and representing law enforcement everywhere, but you've been on that side. You're all law enforcement. Thank you each for your service in this great profession. I'm going to go ahead and start with Laura. We've seen some high-profile officer-involved shooting cases, not just this year, but just in general, that have been, this year in particular, officers that have been in OISs or other high-profile cases have been fired, it seems like, immediately, just within days of something happening like this after the shooting incident. And putting aside part-time and probationary police officers, do you expect this trend to continue? I mean, aren't officers entitled to due process just like everybody else?
Yeah, well, not anybody else, but with law enforcement, we're in a unique position because as an employee, full-time employee of a government agency, a municipality, village or city, they do have certain rights, and procedural due process is one of those things. And I know Lance is involved in representing an officer who was fired immediately following an officer-involved shooting. I'm representing an officer that was fired just 2 days after being involved in a shooting. I mean, the dust hadn't even settled. I mean, no interviews were had of witnesses. The report hasn't been completed, and then before you know it, my client is fired. That's a real problem. And when these officers are fired, they're literally caught off guard, because I can tell you, hearing and then representing these officers, they don't expect that to happen, especially when, based on a lot of the evidence in these cases, they end up being justified. Now, I can't speak to any pending litigation, but typically, we're seeing that once all of the evidence is uncovered, once we have the interviews with witnesses, oftentimes these officer-involved shootings, they're justified. So I see it's a real problem, though, that for whatever reason, I'm aware of at least 4 recent cases where officers have been terminated within days or weeks of being involved in an officer-involved shooting. Now, if there's and I hate to use this term, high-profile incident, but I think we all know what we're talking about when we refer to that. It's got national attention. And so if there's an incident that has national attention, well, we all know people are going to be protesting. People are going to be angry. People who are not members of the community may come to that community to voice their concerns. And then before you know it, we may have a mob, and there may be threats of, property damage. And there have been, incidents of property damage and vandalism and looting and rioting. So I'm thinking that some of these municipalities and these chiefs of police or mayors or whoever is making the decision, they're saying, you know what, if we're going to weigh an officer's procedural due process rights against saving our city, well, I think we're going to make the choice of saving our city. And if that's the decision that's being made, we're in a world of hurts. But that's just my personal observation.
Lance, do you think, let me go to you, sir. Do you think this is going to continue into the future? I mean, this trend, it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. It's not going anywhere.
Sure. So, one of the things that I talk about in Blue News, that book I wrote about media response for law enforcement, is they don't tell their own story, and they're stuck with this, it's in the middle of it. Do we say what we know? Because a lot of times they know a lot. I'll just use an example. Everybody knew Michael Brown wasn't shot in the back. It wasn't a simple thing it wasn't a tough thing to find out. Any homicide detective probably looked at him for about 3 seconds and said he wasn't shot in the back. But when we don't tell our own story, that narrative runs. And what we're seeing, I'd like to say political expediency, but I've never known being politically correct. So it's cowardice. But here's why it's fundamentally, colossally stupid to fire an officer immediately after a situation. So let's take a situation where you claim there's systemic racism in a department. Now that means, keep in mind, if there's systemic racism, you recruited them, you hired them to the exclusion of somebody else, you retained them, you trained them, you promoted them, and you kept them on the street. So if you have a systemic racism problem, the United States Supreme Court in Garrity gave you an opportunity as a government entity that is unparalleled. You can force someone to answer your questions, to route out problems about your recruiting. If you have a systemic racism problem, if you have a cultural problem. So when you fire that person, you give up the best opportunity you have to fix that department, all in the name of political expediency.
Great points. Scott, a big thing that we heard about in 2020 was qualified immunity. I know here in Colorado, they've chipped away at it with new legislations. Look, if we eradicate qualified immunity, which a lot of states, it seems like they're going towards that, how will that impact how we train law enforcement in the future? And we all are familiar with Granby Connor. the standard when it comes to use of force. Can you answer that, sir?
It's a difficult thing to get a racehorse not to run as fast as it can. And basically, to me, that when you train a police officer to enforce the law, keep the community safe, that's a horse that's going to run as fast as it can, full speed, and do what it can the way it's been trained. And from a risk management standpoint, not just for the cities, but for officers who get kicked to the curb by the city, who may not have any protection from a judgment, then you've got to get people to start being a mind frame where they can control their desire to go out and make the most arrests, to catch the every single person that tries to run and get away from them for whatever crime. But I've said this now for about 10 years. Beware the misdemeanor arrest. So many of my cases in civil litigation that we don't prevail on a summary judgment motion, or that we get beat on at a trial, are relatively minor things that turn into something bigger. But the first prong of the Graham v. Connor test is the severity of the crime.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a very significant crime. The score is already 1-0, and we got 2 more prongs to go. So I think we have to get officers to think smarter about what they choose to get involved in. There are some times where, let's face it, we have almost everyone has body-worn camera evidence nowadays. And how hard is it going to be to either you already know who the suspect is, or you can find out who they are. And let's go back with the right resources, 2, 3 days later, 4 days later, after you get a out of custody affidavit for that person, and be a little more cautious and pulled back on what we do. Now, when I say that in use of force classes that I teach, man, they look at me like a tree full of owls. What on earth is this guy talking about? And one guy stood up, an officer from here in Oklahoma, and said, I will never, ever let someone go that's broke the law. And I said, well,
wow,
be sure you keep my number. Cards up here. So, because qualified immunity is, and I don't know if this was all over the country, but when I first started practicing in the civil rights arena in 2000, 2001, I was getting summary judgment granted 75, 80% of the time. I mean, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I thought, I should have been doing this my whole career. And then around 2008, 2009, it kind of, the pendulum kind of changed a little bit. And, had a 3 or 4 really, really dry years as far as getting people out on summary judgment, winning at the circuit. And usually, in most cases, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like what you said, Scott. It all resonated with me, but I really like what you said about there's a time and a place to engage it, but there's also a time and a place to disengage. And I think it comes with good training. I was blessed to have great training. And I was always taught as a very young officer, look, there's a time and a place. Sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away. But it seems like a lot of this falls down to just training, and who officers are surrounding themselves with. Because the officer that stood up and said, I'm never going to let somebody, look, sometimes you have to disengage. Just, yeah,
right.
Unbelievable.
The other side of that, coming from an at-will employment state, is people being fired for dereliction of duty because somebody got mad, somebody didn't arrest somebody.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of the other side of it. And, we've got some police chiefs and sheriffs and city managers and county managers who, I guess, what's the politically correct for lack of gumption. How was that? Laura, was that pretty good? But I have seen officers that were disciplined, and I've gone to IAs with people who were sanctioned for dereliction of duty for not making an immediate arrest.
Yeah, and I think you hit it, Lance. I mean, I talk to a lot of cops, as does every one of you, and one of the biggest complaints now in law enforcement, not the number one, but it's up there, is this feeling and perception is reality most of the time, that officers don't believe that the administration has their back. And that's reason why a lot of cops I talk to, they're looking for an exit ramp, because they don't feel like they have that. Again, this isn't an indictment on every law enforcement department out there and every command staff. I'm just saying that's the complaint that I hear from a lot of officers. So,
well, Patrick, if I can
go ahead,
just
sir.
Go to the next question. What I'm spending a lot of time doing now through Von Kliem Consulting, and also we're doing a lot of this with Force Science, is we're prepping the battlefield at this point. We are preaching to the choir. We are trying to help these administrators, the officers, see clearly what is happening. And part of that conversation is an understanding of this concept of progressive prosecutors and the progressive reform movements.
Yeah.
And one of the most important things that seems to resonate with officers and to help them have that aha moment, like, okay, well, that makes more sense, is we're having a conversation and we're winning a game that the other side's not playing. And what I mean by that, the progressive prosecution and the progressive reform movement, they have a different narrative. The narrative is that the police are racist, abusive, and corrupt. That is foundational. And from that foundation, the evidence of that is the lack of equity in the criminal justice system. And the definition of equity, as they term it, because they're controlling the language, it's an inequality in outcome. And so it's different than equality. It's inequality in outcome. So what they simply do is they look and say, the police are using force more frequently against Black suspects. The police are arresting Black suspects more frequently. The police are shooting Black people in a level that is higher than their representation in the population. The sleight of hand that they're doing, and keep in mind, everyone listening to this is probably thinking that's simply not true. That's okay. Facts don't matter at this point. This is their narrative, and it's generated a lot of momentum and a lot of reform. And we've seen this at the legislative levels, at the local levels, at the agency level. But when you have that foundation, and the only evidence for that is this idea of equity, what they then have to turn is, we're talking about, all they want to do then is get to a point of equity. We don't care if the shooting was lawful, you shot another young Black man. We don't care if the arrest was lawful, you arrested another Black man. All of these reform movements are meant to really put the responsibility on the back of the police officer rather than the suspect or the victim. And so they've shifted from victim rights to suspect rights, all in the name of equity. And this is their narrative. This is what they're telling us. And so what Scott mentioned, this concept of proportionality, this is part of the reform movement's language as they're trying to change use of force policies, is they're talking about redefining imminence, redefining proportionality, redefining use of force to be the lowest level or the minimum amount, only when necessary. So we're seeing all this terminology that historically has no meaning in application to the police. We know this. Those are terms at common law that may have been applied to civilians. They're sometimes used in military circles, but we don't have a lot of cases that help us understand what those terms mean when applied to the police. And the challenges that's creating, Scott, you brought up an excellent point. They define proportionality as the threat of the force being threatened, like what will be the consequence of the force being threatened, as balanced against the government interest being served, as balanced against the lawful objective. And they want the officer to do that at the point of contact. And so it goes to what Scott's point was, and I've read this recently, if it's a misdemeanor and you have to use force, let them go. The shoplifter is not worth arresting if it requires you to use force. That's their narrative, that's their perspective. my sense of that, and again, keep in mind, their goal is to reduce the number of people that are arrested. It's not to reduce crime. It's not about officer safety. It's not about public safety. They will give a tip of the hat to those concepts by saying, well, if you just stop arresting people, all these other things will naturally take care of themselves. That's about the extent of their arguments. But Scott, to your point, if that proportionality analysis has to take place, and we all agree, officers, there's just some people it's not worth using force against. Mm-hmm. That should be a decision that the politicians make, and they need to put that in writing. And the example I use is we already see that with car chases, and they say the benefit's not worth the risk. So they just put it in paper and say, do not chase. And cops understand what that means. And any cost that is associated or any consequence that is associated with that political decision or that economic cost benefit decision, however you want to frame it, it falls squarely on the back of the person who signed that policy. Mm-hmm. So the officers don't have to think about it, it's done. If we equally want to reduce a number of shootings or a number of arrests, and some politician or some agency leader wants to say, if you suspect the person has a gun and they take off running from you, do not chase them. If you don't chase them, we will not have shootouts during the chase. At the point of contact, we will have no use of force, and we won't have an arrest. And so you have, from a progressive reform perspective, you've hit three big targets: no arrest, no shooting, no use of force. And if they want to do that, they have the authority to do that, but many of them won't do that because they do not want to have to deal with the consequences of those type of policy directives. And so they end up doing what Scott defined, which is they put it on the back of the officer, and then they believe that it was just foreseeable and predictable. The officer should have known. It wasn't worth, this particular misdemeanor did not weigh severely enough or important enough that you should have used force. And then we end up with Lance's position, which is, and as soon as they do that, they're going to be held for dereliction of duty, right? And what's comical about all this is the actual community members aren't asking for that. This is purely progressive reform proposals. If you actually ask the community members, they're like, yeah, I want you to arrest him. Yeah. Right. I want you to chase him down and arrest him. And so what we're doing is we're sort of establishing the battlefield, or prepping the battlefield, is at least getting the decision makers to see clearly what the narrative is, what the goals are, because if we don't see that, we end up arguing traditional law enforcement objectives like officer safety, public safety, crime reduction. We'll talk about the facts of the LVNR and say, well, the LVNR actually was designed to reduce injury to officers, reduce injury to suspects, and it's proven incredibly effective to that end. And the other side's going, no, because it's a chokehold, it looks bad, and we are using the chokehold and now pulling the LVNR into that as part of our narrative that the police are racist, abusive, and corrupt, and you're not taking that from us. Mm-hmm. And so seeing clearly what the actual conversation needs to be is the first step right now, or we're just going to keep beating our heads against the wall.
Well, and it's interesting you say that. You said, why won't the politicians pass those laws? Why won't the legislatures? Well, it's a failure of leadership and a lack of courage. And I'll give you an example. There's an underlying issue there too. They are intentionally misleading people. So for example, I was talking to the Illinois State Legislature before Thanksgiving, and they were talking about qualified immunity. And they were of the belief that if an officer commits a murder and is convicted of murder and then goes and gets sued, that they'll get qualified immunity. And we're like, wait a minute, where do you get this stuff? So, I just did a short video, because here's the other problem. We now have street officers being asked about the nuances of qualified immunity by people that they see in restaurants. And, when you mention that everybody in government has some level of qualified immunity, and then you talk about a study that we did at the FOP, 252 appellate cases were examined, and officers got qualified immunity on only 53% of them. Mm-hmm. So there's, I'd like to say that it's an intellectual battle. There are people intentionally lying about this. I think some of them can't spell qualified or immunity, but they're experts.
Well, that's a great point, Lance. And look, I mean, going back to, use of force, I agree. You got the president-elect advocating shooting people in the leg. I mean, what did he say that in the summer, when it came to why can't we just shoot them in the leg? So my personal opinion is when, quote, leaders of our country, whether it's state, municipal, at the federal level, are advocating some of this stuff, of course, people are going to, buy into it. And of course, people are just going to chat about qualified immunity because they don't educate themselves. They just kind of, not everybody, but some people just go along with the herd.
Yeah, you make a good point. I think Scott might be trying to say something, but I have learned to be very careful to recognize that there are a big mass of people on both the Democrats and the Republicans that are simply confused at this point. They have been lied to so frequently, and I call it this massive anti-police marketing campaign that's been very, very successful. And so we have to keep that in mind, that they've been lied to. And we know it's intentional lies because, like Lance said, we'll know the facts of a case that we're not even involved in, but we know people, or to me, I'll just read a local newspaper and that's where I can get some facts that I know will be distorted later on the national news. Local news usually does a decent job. But I'll know all the facts and then I'll watch the news and it's a complete distortion. It's an intentional distortion. They're starting the narrative. It's an anti-police narrative. And then after this massive multimedia anti-police campaign, they then look to the officers and say, the individual officers responsible for building community trust or rebuilding community trust and accountability and transparency. And we hear these buzzwords as though that individual officer can do anything at his local level to combat this massive national and international anti-police campaign that we've been seeing for, I mean, really 2009, Scott, that was a great year because we know that's when it turned. So yeah, I agree 100% with you, Lance. That's the point is they are lying. The problem is the people, we have to now somehow find a way to distinguish the pure leftists, the Black Lives Matter self-proclaimed Marxist type of Black Lives Matter. Now we have to deal with another type of Black Lives Matter, which is at the local level, who doesn't know what the word Marxist means. They just think they're rallying for, because they've been convinced that the police have been racist, abusive, and corrupt, and they don't think that's fair. And when you look at it from what they've been steadily fed over the last 3 years, well, actually since 2015 and on, it's no wonder they mistrust the police and view the police as illegitimate. That was intentional. Mm-hmm. That's been created. And now it's expected that the individual officer is supposed to have an answer to that. And so I'm trying to be very careful about not including everybody in that same distorted lens.
So what would each of you think about, I mean, it's been harder in the last handful of years to recruit, retain good officers. Like I said, a lot of officers I know are looking for a way out. They're looking for an exit ramp. So how do we, for each of you, what are your thoughts on recruitment and retaining good officers who want to do the job? It seems like it's getting more and more difficult to get good officers. I remember early in my career, 2 decades ago, you'd go, and I remember applying for Denver Police Department, and there was like 1,000 people there. I remember before I left, when I was in charge of recruitment in my agency, you'd get 5 people showing up for 3 or 4 openings. And it's what advice would each of you give for the listener out there? Not everybody that's listening to this is current Leo or in the criminal justice field, but maybe they want to. What advice would you give somebody out there? Let's go around and what would each of you give them? Go ahead, Laura.
It takes a special person. Bottom line, it just takes somebody, and I know it sounds so cliche-ish, I just want to help people. But, I was only a police officer for approximately 7 years. And in that time frame, I can count on maybe a handful of calls that made a difference for me, meaning that I knew I made a difference in somebody's life. And if you're the type of person that you don't need to get the pat on the back every day, you're going to survive in this job, because you have to have that internal satisfaction that you made a difference. And you may not see it every day that you're on the job, because we all know that you're not going to see it every day on the job. We know that. But I think, all of us, if we look back, there are that handful of calls that is like, you look at it and you say, damn, that's a proud moment for me as an individual. And so it's just going to take people who have that internal mechanism that they just want to do a decent job. And let's be real. I mean, from my standpoint, it can be a good job if you're in the right department. And we all know, though, if you end up in that department that has bad leadership at the top, it's unfortunate. We know that there are those types of agencies out there, but I think if we appeal to those type of people, we're still going to be able to recruit. And I have to have that belief. I don't want to believe that law enforcement is going down the tubes. I just can't do that.
Yeah, that's well said. And I said before, I said, thank God that we have brave men and women who want to do this job.
Absolutely.
Who still want to do the job. Lance, what do you think, brother?
First of all, I had to laugh. Part of it, the recruitment, is getting out the truth and letting people know that some of the nonsense, really people don't believe it. I did an interview the other day talking about Biden's statement about shooting him in the leg. And I said to the radio host, I said, well, I can assure you, if you attack Biden right now, the federal agents guarding him will not shoot you in the leg. I can 100% guarantee that. He started laughing. Yeah. And one of the things, I say to the public is, if you don't like the current group of law enforcement officers, to Vaughn's point, if you think they're all a bunch of horrible people who are stupid, who can't do anything, and they're racist and they're terrible, well, you're going to hate the second string. Because when all the people who are volunteering to put up with all the nonsense they're putting up with, one department that I came from has 4 practicing attorneys working in the department as police officers. Officers are incredibly well trained. Wow. They're well educated. If those folks walk off the job, and I've had a lot of people tell me that qualified immunity is the straw waiting over the camel. If that fails, they're out. If we don't get a control over that rationality of why somebody would want to be a law enforcement officer and keep those protections, we're going to have a serious problem. But here's the other thing about public servants. All of us have had that really bad day. Laura, when you couldn't go to a call that made a difference if you asked the dispatcher to send you to one. And what made a difference to you when you're sitting there having something to eat is when a private citizen comes up and says, I'm really glad you're here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I think the biggest recruiting tool in any community is the community itself. And I don't think they're engaged enough just to come up and thank the officers and tell people in the high schools and people in the college and their neighbors, hey, that department over there is pretty good. You ought to think about becoming a law enforcement officer. Because if we lose that word of mouth recruiting, there's no amount of money and no amount of billboards you can put up. They're going to change it.
Yeah, I agree, Lance. I think part of the problem, in my opinion, is I think the overwhelming majority of people out there support law enforcement. I think maybe I'm just naive. I think people nowadays are so afraid to say something because they don't want to be that neighbor or that guy or that woman who supports law enforcement and then be all over social media. I cannot believe you support those racists. I think people do. I wish they were more vocal. I say that all the time, but I agree with you about the community. What do you think, Scott? Recruitment, retention?
Yeah, I'm living out here in Oklahoma on the edge of civilization. People really, really love their police officers here. And I know we've had some recruitment challenges just because of some of the direction that's been given by, we had a consent decree here that was in place about 17 or 18 years ago. And we had some mandates about what categories of people we had to recruit from and for every class, or mandates to meet. And as we kind of went through we started getting into, I guess, what we would term the millenniums who were old enough to become police officers. I was really, really kind of surprised about the quality of people that we got here. And they are different. When I got on, most of the guys that had 10 years on or more in 1980, almost all of them had been in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's a very different background from what these people that are coming on the department. I think we had a class just this last August that graduated in Tulsa. There's 52% women, more women than men in the class. And so that's a constant fear that lingers in the backs of people's minds about who the second team is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
When do we start scraping the bottom of the barrel and get someone that's been a security guard for 10 years and now he's finally going to, get his chance to become a police officer. I just haven't seen that here. We're still good quality people.
That's awesome. And, we can't lower our standards in law enforcement. We have to keep those standards high. I always said when I was a commander and we were looking at hiring, I would rather go short on the street than hiring somebody that doesn't have the qualifications just to fill a body on the street, because then you're going to have more. I'm not saying they're going to get in trouble, but I would rather wait and get some good apples than hire some bad apples. And then you're going to have bigger problems down the road. You know what I mean? So, Vaughn, what do you think, brother? Recruitment, retention, what can we do better?
It's a two-part thing. So I'll tell you this, that if a community says and means we've got your back as they're doing this recruiting campaign, they're going to get a lot of people. There's still a lot of people who want to be police. And by the way, there's a lot of people who are so now aware and insulted by what's been happening over the last few years that they're stepping up to the plate and they want to play. They want to know how they can support the police and be the police and fight the good fight. So they're still out there. But Lance talks about getting your story out there, which is harder and harder at the national level with the censorship that's going on. You got to get creative on how to get your story out there. But at the local level, I think you can be very successful. And one of the things that needs to happen is these people are going to come in. Some of these recruits are coming in with this idea that they want to be reformers. Because here's what needs to be understood again from our audience. When cops are being called racist today, they're not talking in terms of traditional racism. They're not talking like that. Yeah, okay, I'll just stop there. They're not talking in terms of traditional racism. What they're talking about is this concept of anti-racism, which is any institution that you can point to a racial disparity. So we're back to that equity issue. Any institution in America, banking, education, policing, criminal justice, our court system, if there's inequity, a disparity of representation when you compare population-based statistics and representation, that's all they look at. Once they've decided that the institution is racist, you must actively take steps to destroy and dismantle the institution of racism. If you do not actively take steps to dismantle the system of racism, in this case, policing, you are therefore, by their definition, racist. Mm-hmm. And so they've set up a no-win situation because the first question they ask you is, are you racist? And if you say no, that makes you racist because you're not aware of it. And the second thing is you say, no, I'm not racist, I'm a police officer. And they say, well, what are you doing to dismantle that system of oppression? And if you say, I'm just trying to be a good cop, insufficient, you're racist. And this is why Hispanic officers and Black officers and white officers and Asian officers can all be racist under this new definition of anti-racism. So having said that, what is going to convince a lot of these recruits is to bring them on. A lot of agencies, Matt Cobb out of Topeka, Kansas, has really put a lot of work into recruiting programs. And one of the things he does is he gets applicants to come and do ride-alongs. Before they like, if you ever want to sign up for the test, we want you to come meet us and spend time in our city, meet our city governments, see what the zoo that we have and our cool, art center. We want you to understand the culture of our city. And you're required to do ride-alongs and to watch some academy classes. So they're not going to sign up, go through the training and quit, because what we're finding is a lot of these people are coming in because they want to reform the police profession from the inside. And what ends up being a truly effective experience for them or turning point is when they see that the reality of the street and the reality of the relationship between the police and the minority communities, when they see the reality of how long-suffering and patient and humane and dignified, and to Lance's point, how well-trained and mature the officers are, and of course, those are the officers you should be having them ride with, then it's a moment for them where they can start to disbelieve everything else they'd already heard. And one of the stories I've used for this, I had a sergeant out in San Francisco asked me if I was willing to take a knee to show my commitment to Black Lives Matter. And I said, no, that's a hard no. And he's like, why not? And some of you have heard this before from me, but I think it's worth pointing out. I said, look, American law enforcement take a knee for the Black community all the time. I've taken a knee to give CPR to a student who was a Black student. I gave him mouth to mouth. A Black old man fell out in the police department. I gave him mouth to mouth resuscitation. The young Black gang member who was shot hanging upside down in a car that he had just wrecked, strapped into a seatbelt. I had to get on my knees and climb in there, and I was the last person he saw. And I prayed with him. I was the last voice he heard. We take a knee to shield children during domestic violence cases. We take a knee to pray with the mothers who have just lost their kids. And I say that, and there's no hyperbole. These are things that we literally do routinely for and with the Black communities. And yet the national narrative is American police are racist, abusive, and corrupt, and they need to take a knee in some virtue signaling and hollow, meaningless effort to show our commitment. We have to reclaim that. And one of the ways to do that is get them exposed to the reality of policing and see the best of what we're doing. And those moments, hopefully then they can't look back. Some people call it a red pill moment. I don't know that nimbly applies here, but it's that moment where you catch society or you catch the national media in a lie that they have told over and over and over again. And once you catch them in that lie once, you disbelieve everything else they've said, and then you can start effectively policing your community.
Well said, Vaughn. Thank you. I got one final area I want to cover with each of you and get your perspectives and advice on it. As lawyers, each of you represent law enforcement. You consult, you train. What are the most important things you can teach, or we can teach officers to help them prepare them to survive a high-profile case? Maybe if it's a OIS, maybe it's an in-custody death. Let's go ahead and start with you, Laura. What's some advice that you can give officers that find themselves in these cases and situations?
They need to be aware that it's not a matter of if it's going to happen to them. It's a matter of when.
Yeah, good advice. Yeah.
Because I can, to Lance's point, I've been there in the immediate aftermath of an officer-involved shooting, within hours, and it's something when you've got a grown man with children just bawling, just absolutely bawling because they're horrified at what is potentially coming down the pipe. And more times than not, I hear from my clients, I never thought it could happen to me. I never imagined it could happen to me. And so what I'm telling, and it's not just tonight, in response to your question, Patrick,
Sure.
This is what I'm telling police officers anytime that I have a conversation about a critical incident or an officer-involved shooting. You have to assume it's going to happen to you. You have to assume that you're the next officer that's going to be all over the news. You have to assume that. And so if you assume that, you've got to have all of your ducks lined up in a row. Because even when you have all of your ducks lined up in a row, which means, be part of a legal defense plan, and I just want to expound on that in a minute. Even when officers have their ducks lined up in a row, the stuff's going to hit the fan anyway, because you can't, there's so many variables that, you have no control over the personal agendas of the mayor, the community members, the media. There's just way too many variables that officers don't have any control of. But so the broader picture that I recommend to officers is just don't have that mindset of, oh, it can't happen to me. It's never going to happen in my little town of, 20 police officers.
Oh, yeah.
Because it can.
Mhm.
The other piece of advice that I recommend, and this is based on, my following the work of Lance, my following the work of Scott, talking with Vaughn, is, when officers are sued civilly, the majority of times, I think all the time, I think it would be very rare for an officer not to have legal counsel assigned to them by the municipality or the insurance company that insures the municipality. So that's in a civil lawsuit. If officers are part of a union, they're going to have the union representing them in any potential disciplinary matter that results from, an officer's use of force or whatever. But officers, they don't even contemplate the fact that they could be faced with criminal charges. And then when they're faced with criminal charges, then they have that pucker factor moment. It's like, oh, what now? What do I do? And I know Scott knows this very well from his experience with a very high profile case. It's expensive to have a really good legal defense team representing an officer in a criminal defense matter. And the city's not going to pay for it. Union's not going to pay for it. So an officer's going to pay for it. And in some high profile cases, we're talking about $500,000. And you tell me what officer's got $500,000 anywhere that's available to help them pay for that legal defense team. So I want to say, the 1A piece of advice, or I should say the 1B piece of advice, is officers need to be a member of some sort of a legal defense plan. And I'm not, there's a number of them out there, and I'm not going to tell officers which one's better than another. To me, just get on a legal defense plan and get that criminal representation.
Great advice, Laura. Lance, my friend, your advice?
Sure. So all the profits go to law enforcement charities, so I have no problems plugging my book, When Cops Kill.
Good.
To date, we've donated about $35,000 to
awesome.
law enforcement charities. So it's called When Cops Kill. You can get it at bluelinelawyer.com. But I wrote this book from the perspective of a firearms instructor, a cop, and a lawyer who had seen a lot of people go through this. And it's basically tells you what to expect when the smoke clears. And, I can tell the people listening to this with every ounce of my being that I don't think there is a better legal defense plan out there than the Fraternal Order of Police legal defense plan, because it does cover criminal. It is paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend officers. And I want to say that how proud I am to sit in this type of company. All of you are heroes in my book. And I have told officers when I've sat with them, as Laura said, as Vaughn has said, praying with them, and they're going through what we know is going to be the roughest road of their lives, that you do the right thing in those tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving circumstances that we heard about in Graham. And then you have to be prepared for whatever comes and know that the truth is going to come out. I represented an officer recently who was just very torn up about the emotion, and he's very religious, and about the philosophy that he just took a life. And I use that as an example to bring to departments what they need to do as part of this. Too often, well, I'll tell you, the number one complaint officers have after a shooting is isolation. So what I've told agencies, right, as soon as if you're a commander in an agency, if you're an agency head, you need to do this tomorrow. You have an officer involved in a shooting. It's either good or bad, but you gave them the gun and the bullets. So you own them. But you need to assign somebody of a command staff level to own them, call them every day, check on them. I've had officers who were afraid to go to the grocery store because they were being attacked on the media. Find a place for them to be. I have an officer right now who is in hiding and has been for several months because of the death threats he's been receiving. So it can get bad, and it will get bad. And as Laura said, don't think it's not going to happen to you. All you can do is train as much as you can, get every ounce of experience that you can from the elders in this profession, and do everything you can and pray that they don't leave us, because we're going to be in a world of hurt if they do. But, read as much as you can, learn as much as you can, and have that protection through, as I said, the FOP Legal Defense Plan, I think, is the best one out there. It's an unlimited plan, because you need the resources to fight. And probably the hardest thing for officers to realize if they get into a shooting, especially if it's high profile, is every institution that you walked around with that badge on that supported you may turn upside down and look like the enemy. They may not be, but they may look like the enemy. The media is talking about you. The ADA is considering prosecuting you. You're now having to talk to an attorney about criminal charges you never thought about. It's time to prepare for that early, because if you get through your career and it never happens, that's awesome. But the chances are today it could happen over just a misdemeanor arrest, as Scott was saying.
Yeah. And thank you, Lance. Well said. Such great advice. I'm a big fan of FOP. We had an OIS a couple of years ago, and within 45 minutes of us coming back to the police department with the officer involved, there were 3 lawyers there from the FOP. It was just amazing, their response. And I'm sure many other organizations are like that, but great advice, Scott. Or Lance, I'm sorry. Scott, on to you, brother. I think you're muted.
You're muted, Scott.
This is the international symbol for you're muted.
There he is.
I learned a lot in the Terrence Crutcher shooting, kind of on the fly. But luckily, a lot of what my instincts told me, and a lot of what I had learned from working with some people in the media that were really pro law enforcement, that someone here locally that encouraged me to never say, this is a pending investigation. We're not going to make any statements right now, while the other side just runs wild with whatever their false narrative is. So it really does take a lot of discipline following a shooting. A couple of years ago, I had a shooting in Muskogee, Oklahoma. A client, I've been representing them for 20 years, and I've probably given a half dozen seminars over the years on use of force, officer-involved shootings. Don't ask the officer what happened. Just make sure he's got everything. Call legal counsel, all that checklist. And so we have a video of this officer after an intense struggle that ended with the death of a really large mentally ill person, trying to catch his breath on the hood of the car, bleeding. And in about 7 or 8 minutes, there were at least 5 or 6 officers, all of whom had been in my class, came up to check on the officer, pat him on the back, and leaned over and said, "What happened?"
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to really tell people that you have to be disciplined. We tell you to not talk to anybody or make any statements for a reason. We don't want to make extra witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. With the body worn cameras and dash cameras now, there's not very many conversations that do not get recorded. Let's face it. But one of the things that I think officers need to realize early on, if they're in a high profile case and it looks like they may be criminally prosecuted, how much hard work it's going to be for them to defend themselves. You cannot just show up and let the lawyers do the work for you. Lance, I don't know how many cases you've ever had where you defended an officer and didn't put him on the witness stand, but kind of here in Oklahoma, people would be really put out if an officer didn't get up and tell his story about what happened. And that is a challenge, my friend, especially when it's been a high profile case where you've been getting the short end of the stick for most of the time the case is pending. We did something kind of unusual with Betty Shelby about 5 months before her trial. 60 Minutes had just been on us for 2 or 3 months wanting to do an interview with Betty. And there'd been so much negative publicity about that shooting. And it was unanswered by the district attorney's office. False information was given out about how he came to be there, whether or not the car was operational or not, or whether or not the window was open that she thought he was reaching into to get a gun. And so there's a rule for criminal courts here that allows you to rebut publicly false criticisms that are not being answered by the DA's office or the police department. So we made a calculated risk to get her prepared and go on 60 Minutes to try to turn that tide of public sentiment about what had happened. And the fact that Terrence Crutcher was not a gospel singer. He was a certified gang member. And the fact that the day before he had been possession in a gun, again, high on PCP, and pointed it at somebody's head less than a half mile away from where he was shot on the very next day. Mm-hmm. So Alexis Artwall was so much help to us because she watched that interview with Betty and gave us some really, really good tips about how she could improve herself and be more acceptable to the jury. And to Betty's credit, you know, after she got acquitted, she worked at the Tulsa Police Department for about 3 or 4 weeks and just couldn't do it. They had her stuck in a cubicle for her own safety. And then she went to a nearby county sheriff's office, and everybody loved her. She did great. And I think this is one of the questions that we had circulated before our podcast today about, can you really go on after going through a traumatizing event like that? And Betty continued to work in law enforcement for a couple of years, and then her husband retired, and she's no longer in law enforcement. But she developed a special talent, and she calls officers all over the country that have been charged in shootings and talks to them about her experience and the things that she learned to do to cope and be able to address the needs of the case and do what her lawyers ask her to do while still maintaining this really uneary calmness through the whole thing. I'll never forget sitting right next to her right before the jury came back and kind of reached over and grabbed her hand. And she said, no matter what, I'm going to be okay. I know I am. And it was just astounding. And I'm glad she is making that effort to reach out to other officers that are in the same position that she was in.
Thank you so much, sir. That's a very good story, and I appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience and great advice, sir. Last but not least, my good friend Vaughn.
Yeah, thank you. So I think if there's been a theme here, it's that the officers need to know that it's not enough to be right anymore. It's not enough to be reasonable anymore. It's not enough to be lawful. There still may very well be a process that they're going to have to suffer through and be an active participant in. And as they go through that, they need to have in their hip pocket an attorney who's not just competent, but that is expert. And we have sort of identified the expertise that we want as minimum standards. And so I want officers, as they're preparing for their day, for that critical incident response, to ask themselves, and well in advance, is your attorney a police practices expert? Is your attorney a use of force expert? Is your attorney a body cam expert? Is your attorney a human performance expert? Is your attorney an expert in the law of self-defense or the law of use of force? And it's unlikely that your attorney is going to be all of those things, except if you get maybe the attorneys on this panel you very likely are going to get experts in all of those things. They'll still need to bring someone else in to sit on the stand, but find those people in advance. And if that attorney that you like to work with and is an expert at litigation and knows the judges well, knows the culture well, there's a lot of value in that. They need to have an expert in their hip pocket. Someone like me, someone like Jamie Borden, someone like Dr. Lewinsky. Those are the people who you can just be the second brain. You can be the person who knows the police practices and knows the human factors. And so for those listening who aren't familiar with this idea of human performance or human factors, one of the things that really is an expert who understands the limitations of just being a human, the psychological limitations and the physiological limitations of actually performing use of force and assessing threats. And that is a specialty, and it is a rare specialty. And I think everyone on this panel have intimate relationships and training and even advanced levels with human performance through the Force Science Institute. Find those people in advance, get them identified, and know there is a difference between attorneys who've been to those trainings and the attorneys who haven't. The ones who haven't, again, could be phenomenal, maybe exactly who you need, but they need to get those experts in their hip pocket. Laura and I want to do this plug because I think it's important. We've developed training called the Law of Violence. What we're trying to do is educate attorneys on the reality of police use of force decision-making. And in fact, we're actually going broader than that. We are educating attorneys on both sides of the aisle. And I think we're even going to try to get into law schools and start working on the law students on the realities of deadly force encounters, whether it's a police officer or a civilian, because that is a massive gap and it is not anything we learn in law school. And so we're doing our part to help these officers have a stable of qualified attorneys they can turn to on the night of the shooting, and then to walk alongside them and stand in front of them when they need to during this process.
So it's great advice. Thank you, each of you, for your expertise, your advice, the information you shared with the listeners and the viewers. Now, lastly, I'd like to just start out with Vaughn, since we left on you. And if people want to get a hold of each of you, we can go around again. How do they get a hold of you, Vaughn?
Yep. If you're a LinkedIn, find me on LinkedIn. Vaughn, just make sure you spell the last name correctly and you'll find me. It's Kliem. You can also find me at VaughnKliem@gmail.com, one word. And I have a website, VaughnKliemConsulting.com. Any of those you'll be able to find me pretty quickly. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you. Any questions, certainly reach out.
Thank you, sir. Laura, ma'am?
I'm also on LinkedIn. It's Laura Scarry, the last name like Boo, but 2 R's. So, but if you want to get a hold of me by email, it's lscarry, just like it appears on my screen there, LSCARRY and the firm name is Deano and Scarry, but it's DEANOSCARRY.com.
Lance, sir?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. At least I am right now. I guess that remains to be seen. But you can also find me at bluelinelawyer.com or LanceLarussoBooks.com. And its last name, as you can see there, is a little bit strange. It's LORUSSO. But, you know, we reach out to a lot of folks. It's pretty easy to get a hold of me. But, you know, everybody on here, I can tell you right now, is if you shoot them an email, if you contact them on LinkedIn, social media, we're going to respond. It's what we do. So I hope we hear from folks.
Thank you, sir. And Scott?
Yes, I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can reach me at OKCoplaw, OKCOPLAW, at OKCoplaw@gmail.com.
Thank you, each and every one of you. Everything we talked about is going to be linked up in the show notes, including contact information, website information. Everything will be linked up. I want to thank each and every one of you. Thanks again for your honorable service to this great career, law enforcement, and thank you for your continuing work with the brave men and women who protect us every day. Anything I can do for each of you or any of you, please reach out to you. Much success to each of you in the future. Thanks for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Patrick.
you.
Thank you.